So I'm here today to talk about my problem with the modern thriller formula when it comes to books. And before I get too far into the context of this, I want to talk more about my own backstory as a reader of thrillers. For those of you that are OG subscribers, back when I was a baby booktuber, love to know if you're watching this, please leave a comment. But my main focus of my channel used to be thrillers. It was what I was known for. The Stabby books was all about reading about serial killers and other murderers and all these twisty turny stories. And so that is originally where I fell in love with adult fiction. It's really where I picked up. I was one of those people who read Gone Girl after college, and it really reignited my love for reading, as we've discussed before. And so from there I went on to read all the books that came afterwards, and there was a flood of books. I've mentioned it before, but I do think that Gone Girl was one of the books that really propelled the launch and popularity of the subgenres, particularly the psychological and domestic thrillers. And I would argue that particularly this boom came from the focus of thrillers not being male-centric books, but instead being ones that are targeted towards women, particularly those who are mothers, housewives, etc., and really focusing on that domestic aspect of the thriller. Now, certainly I'm making generalities with this, but I do also have the analytics when it comes to my YouTube channel, and I can tell you that when I post a video like this talking about thrillers, about 80% of the people watching identify as women. So this isn't just me speaking out of turn, but there is definitely a popularity or focus or positioning of those books to attract female readers. And I do think that there's a lot of conversations around trying to entice women into the genre. Now, of course, I am someone who loved Gone Girl when it first came out, and I have loved other thrillers since then. But because of that, I got to read so many thrillers in the genre that I really got myself burnt out, and I actually got to a point where I declared on one point on my channel that I would never read thrillers again, and I was terrified to lose my entire audience. Thankfully, people came along for the ride as I moved into more horror and literary things and all of that. But I have somewhat returned back to thrillers. I do occasionally read them, but I'm much more picky what I pick up, and more specifically, I'm picky what I finish. I DNF thrillers like nobody's business. I could do an entire video on all the thrillers I have DNF'd because it's a lot. So while there's good books there, I've really wanted to do a video talking about why I've become so critical of this genre. And again, critical of a genre that I otherwise love. I do think there is a lot to love in this genre, but I found that in modern thrillers, in the marketing push, the publishing world just trying to get books sold and out the door, there has been a formula that has been created of three particular elements that I do not love, that I see in the majority of thriller books. Obviously, I'm making some generalizations with this video, but if you've read the genre, you're gonna know what I'm talking about here. And so there's three problems in this formula that I really don't like, and I want to discuss it all with you here. So if that sounds good, let's get started. So I should mention that when I am talking about modern thrillers, I'm specifically talking about books that have been published in the last couple decades. Certainly thrillers have been written for far longer than that, but the current iteration, specifically the formula that I'm discussing here, mostly I've seen in books that are published in the 2000s and then the decades afterwards. So the first part of the formula that I see all the time, and I've come to despise, even though I like it when it's done well. I've talked about liking this trope in other videos, so I don't want to think that I'm misconstruing that, but it's the fact that every single character, or main character at least, has to be unreliable. And this can take multiple forms. So they can be unreliable because they are on drugs, because they are sleep deprived, because they are perhaps schizophrenic or have a mental illness that is known to us as the reader. There are multiple ways that this is positioned that we as a reader know that they are not to be trusted, that we can't necessarily take them at their word. I love when this is done well. My favorite way is, again, if we're going to use the example of Gone Girl, is where the main character of Nick tells us in the first chapter that he, even though we are getting the story from his perspective, is lying to us as the reader and lying to the police. So I do like when it's done in a certain way that creates the mystery that you know that someone is holding something back. What I don't like about this as a trope is the fact that it gets used so often that it becomes tedious and, again, almost becomes a requirement. It's the idea that you can't simply have a character that we can trust their belief, because it makes it so much easier as a writer to write a character and create that, do we trust them? Are they making this up? Are they imagining this? And it just becomes a little bit old. And particularly, if I'm going to complain about part one, it really fits into the issue of the second part of this formula, and that is gaslighting. Without spoiling any particular books, I will let you know that there are numerous books in the genre that are built on the premise of someone being gaslit. So I'm just going to give a generic synopsis that is not referencing any particular book, but you have someone, typically a woman, who is perhaps unreliable in some way, so they or the people around them know that they perhaps cannot be trusted, and then they start to see something in their life, and then those around them, particularly the males, tell them that they're making it up, that it's not true, that it's just because of their unreliable factor, whatever is causing them to be unreliable, that is to blame, and everyone tells them that they are crazy, they are making it up. And then we, as the reader, follow it along and see them unravel, and things get worse and worse and worse. And then at the end of the story, it is revealed that everyone was gaslighting them to begin with, and what they saw was actually real, or at least, even if it wasn't real, it was different than what it was set up to be because of everyone in their life gaslighting them. This is just a trope that I find very frustrating, and the problem is that in a book where they aren't being gaslit, that is typically in a situation that actually turns into a horror story, so it's not actually a thriller at all. So instead you have all of these books where it looks like something's happening, and if you go in with a critical eye, if you are trying to guess the ending of the book, which I'll get to more in a moment, you can pretty much assume that someone is gaslighting them, someone is trying to push their buttons and make things seem like they're not, and you're just trying to figure out who that person is rather than what is happening. And again, it's just a really exhaustive plot because I've seen it so many times that it's not a surprise. You're waiting to discover who is gaslighting them. You already know that it's happening. And I just think it's a little bit tiring. I feel like gaslighting is something that is getting discussed a lot. It's a big part of social media and, you know, is very much part of our modern conversation. And I do think it's overused as a plot device and a trope. And I kind of find it to be lazy because it's just a way of setting up a situation that isn't actually happening. Now, the final part to this formula is the fact that every thriller is expected to have an unguessable twist ending. And I think that there's a lot of pressure on authors to have that twist ending. There is so much of a marketing push to say, oh, this book is unguessable, you'll never guess the ending. And there is so much pressure that there needs to be an aha moment, a reversal, a surprise. And so you can't simply seem to write a thriller that is just thrilling for the sake of suspense. It needs to be more complicated, and I think that authors run into trouble when they have to do that. Now, there are challenges for sure. I'd say within thrillers, often there's only a limited cast of individuals, so again, if you're trying to set up a mystery, you kind of know that it's either the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, or the reporter that comes along for the ride. One of them is probably involved in whatever is happening. And so you're just trying to follow the clues and figure out which is the red herring and which is the actual perpetrator or bad guy, etc. And you're kind of left trying to twist and turn that. And my issue when it comes to these unguessable endings is I feel like certain authors get very desperate to be able to make the claim, you'll never guess my ending, I'm going to surprise you. And so what I see with authors more often than I would like is that they set up the reader so that their ending is unguessable, but it's doing so because in some way it is breaking the contract with the reader and is kind of going out of the bounds of what is acceptable within storytelling. Now, I'm going to discuss a few books that do this, but I'm going to do so in a way that I'm not actually spoiling the ending. So just know if you don't want to know about a book's ending in any vague terms, skip ahead, but I'm just going to reference that these books do it poorly. They're very recognizable entries, so you probably read them or at least are familiar with them. So the first book I want to talk about is The Cuckoo's Calling by Robert Galbraith or J.K. Rowling. This is a mystery that I honestly barely remember the plot of it because I didn't find it very interesting, but the actual twist or reveal sticks in my head distinctly because I felt like it's the kind of plot twist that I would have written if I was writing a mystery when I was about 12 years old. And I'm like, they'll never guess that this person did it. And it's such a stupid reveal in my mind because it's a situation that would never ever happen. And the only reason you would have a reveal like that is because you can close the book and say, well, wow, I did not think that that person was the one who did it. And it's done in a way that is just very cheap in my mind. So I really don't like what that ending did. I'm really surprised how much praise that book got when it first came out, even before it was revealed that it was the author, and then afterwards because I read the book and thought that ending was very stupid. Next, let's talk about the infamous Survive the Night by Riley Sager. This is a story that follows a college student who is returning back home. There was a death on campus. Her roommate was killed by a mysterious serial killer, and then she accepts a ride from a man that she doesn't really know and things go from there. This is one that I absolutely hate, and I never do spoilery content on my channel, except I did a dedicated review to discussing the ending of this book because I thought it was so poorly executed. So this is one where, again, the author is trying to create a twist and turn in the book that the reader will not see coming. And I fully admit I did not see it coming because the author, in my mind, completely broke narrative conventions of storytelling in order to do this twist. Maybe someone thinks it's a smart twist, someone thinks it's clever. It makes no sense to me. You would never see this in any book or movie. I've never seen it anywhere else done. And the reason for that is that it makes no sense. So again, this is one of the few times that if you do want to go and check out my further thoughts, I'll link that video down below and in the cards. But oh man, that book is unguessable, but for a very bad reason. Finally, let's talk about Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinenbrough. This is actually a book that I do not hate, but is unguessable for an unlikable reason. The basic synopsis is that we follow, I believe, a secretary who is involved with this man, and he meets her wife, and it all gets very complicated. Again, it's a book where the actual plot is pretty hazy in my mind because it wasn't very memorable, and I'm too lazy to look up the synopsis online before filming this. So instead, I will say that what sticks in my mind is the ending. And this is a book that I read when I was first getting into reviewing, and I got I believe an e-arc of the book, and the marketers were going crazy online. There was a big hashtag of "you'll never guess the ending." Every reviewer was told to gush about how they could not guess the ending, but of course keep that cone of silence and not actually tell the audience what that secret was. And so I read the book, I followed it through, and then the ending was one I could not guess. But I would argue that the ending is unguessable because the marketers purposely set up the marketing in a way that made the reader not know what type of book they were getting. And it basically only worked because of the marketing hype around the book and the way that reviewers were told to talk about it. So when you actually understand what the book is and what it's doing, it's an entirely different kind of story. And if you knew that, you would be able to decently predict the ending, but of course the marketers wanted this to be a big bang, a big show. And like I said, I gotta admit, it's one of those books that is absolutely stuck in my head as a book that has an unguessable ending, but I don't think that it serves the book well because, as I mentioned, the actual plot was pretty ho-hum. And it's a book that I only think about because of the marketing and not because of the book itself, which is a shame for the author. Now, I probably should turn around this video before I get too negative and talk about what I do like in thrillers and books that do the formula well. So in my opinion, the best kind of thriller is one where the plot perhaps has a twist to it, and it's done in a way that isn't obvious from page one, but allows the reader to have enough clues and hints that they can figure out the story or the twist before it happens. Because in my mind, I love being a reader who feels really smart. Who doesn't like to feel smart when they're reading? And so when I'm reading a book and I notice some little hints and little nods and winks throughout the book, and suddenly I go, oh my gosh, it must be this person, I bet this happened. And then a few pages later, the next chapter, the author reveals it as the truth. I feel so smart. If you look at my ratings on Goodreads, I tend to rate those books higher because I felt really good after reading them, because I felt like an intelligent, smart thriller reader who can guess the ending of those books. But if I look back at them, I'll be honest, the hints and clues were put there for a reason, and I think the author was purposely doing that in order to stroke the reader's ego, including myself. So I'm going to mention a few books again without any spoilers that I think do this pretty well, books that I remember guessing the ending, but having a good time along the way and having that excitement of getting the reveal coming right as I was figuring it all out so that I felt like I was in on the joke. The first book I want to mention is Flicker in the Dark by Stacey Willingham. This is a story of a young woman who, as a child, her father went to prison for killing a couple of young women, and now as an adult there is someone who is copycatting his crimes, and then she is trying to figure out where to go from there. She teams up with a reporter and is trying to navigate her personal life through all of this. This is one where I fully admit I remember pretty early on predicting a couple things about the plot that turned out to be absolutely right. But I also distinctly remember that piece of satisfaction when my guesses turned out to be true, because there are some red herrings within the book that maybe will mislead you, but I felt smart because I saw which ones were the red herring, which ones were the actual leads, and followed along with that and had a really good time, again feeling really smart. It's an enjoyable one. Again, it's not unguessable, but I would argue that most of the books that I've read that I truly could not guess the ending for were ones that were breaking the convention of that relationship between reader and author and trying to write and draw outside the lines in order to be impossible, rather than just writing a really good story that's engaging even if you know what's coming. From there, let's talk about Never Let You Go by Chevy Stevens. This is the thriller that follows a woman who was in an abusive domestic relationship. In the beginning of the book, we get the flashbacks to how she escaped, and then the book is set in her present day where her husband or ex-husband has gone to jail and has now gotten out. And of course, strange things start to happen. It appears like someone is going around her house, possibly breaking in. And so of course, you have to ask, is there something going on? Her husband or ex promises that he has changed. He wants to make things right. And so it's a question of, if someone from an abusive past, if they can actually change their stripes and become a different person. And so I like this book from the get-go because it wasn't really trying to have a twist or turn from the get-go, that you kind of know where the book is going. You basically know from day one that the ex-husband is not a great man. You get to see that on the page. It's not a secret. And then there are some extra things that happen within the book that I obviously don't want to reveal, but because the author laid so much of the groundwork for us to see, I was pleasantly surprised when there was more to it, because I was fine to just go along for the ride. And instead, they actually surprised me by kind of adding extra layers of complexity to a story that seemed pretty straightforward from the synopsis I just gave. So that was one where I distinctly remember texting my friend going, oh my gosh, da-da-da just happened, and enjoying the little twists and turns, the kind of roller coaster ride, because of the fact that I went to the book very relaxed and I wasn't really alert to try to look for a twist, because it didn't really seem like there was going to be anything. And I also want to mention Not a Sound by Heather Gutenkopf, and this is a story that follows a protagonist, a young woman who is deaf, and those aspects are woven into the story, creating a really interesting narrative that talks about disability within the framework of a mystery story. This is one, again, where I remember that there is a limited cast of characters, so I kind of knew that someone had to be behind what was going on, but at the same time, I didn't know which one, and I remember having that experience where I suspected the one person, and then something happened, and my suspicions moved to someone else, and then they moved again, and they moved again, and I very much went along for the ride. And that's what I find with a good thriller, is I actually don't try that hard to figure out the ending if I'm enjoying the ride. I would argue that if I'm more bored reading a book, that's when I really start to put my thinking cap on. If I'm having an enjoyable time, I almost don't want to spoil the fun of what's to come, and instead just enjoy the book as it is laid out for the reader, which I think is what a good author does. So that's another one that I just remember just going along for the ride, having a great time, and coming to a very satisfying conclusion. Last, I want to make the argument that some of the best thrillers out there actually have no true twist or turn to them, and again, lay everything out for the reader to see pretty much from the beginning. Obviously, there are still plot points to ensue, but for the most part, the author is not trying to hide too much from the reader, and instead depending on the suspense or excitement of the plot to propel the reader forward in their journey. So one that comes to mind for me is You by Carolyn Kepnes, a booktube darling and favorite, so you probably know it, but following a man named Joe who works at a bookstore. He becomes infatuated with a young woman and begins to stalk her. The story is told from a second person perspective. So again, there's no surprise that he is a creepy stalker, because we are literally reading the book from his perspective, which is one of my favorite things. I love a book written from the villain's perspective, because again, we know who's bad, we know terrible things are going to happen, and all I want to do is sit back and enjoy the ride. The main character, Joe, has an amazing personality. He is snarky and funny and messed up and dark in all the ways that I love. So again, I just enjoyed spending time with the characters and watching everything explode around him, and it was so much fun. So I didn't need there to be a reveal or a twist and turn out that he was the good guy or anything like that. I was just happy to go along for exactly what the book set out to be, and the book set out those expectations, and then those expectations were perfectly met. Another book that comes to mind is The Butcher by Jennifer Hillier. This is a story that follows a couple who are involved in a relationship. I believe they're engaged. The young woman's mother was killed by the serial killer known as the Butcher, and then you find out that her fiance, his grandfather, was responsible for catching the Butcher and putting him in jail. Now, years later, we find out that perhaps the Butcher is still alive and prolific today. Now, this is a book that by chapter 2, we get the perspective of the Butcher, and everything about this book is virtually explained. You know exactly all the moving pieces, and then you are just, as the reader, watching the train wreck happen. So it's a book that I don't really like to give away all of the plot points in my synopsis, but trust me, within a few minutes of reading it, you will know everything you need to about this book. And once again, it's a book where, again, you have that villain perspective, and you just get to watch things go from bad to worse to absolutely worse, and just the complications ensue. Again, I feel like this book is not trying to hide anything for the reader. I think that that's one of my favorite things about Jennifer Hillier. She tends to write books that are very open-ended, so you as the reader just get to follow along rather than having her depend on surprise twist or something unusual happening that you'll never see coming. And I think that she's one of the authors who I've read several books where she does that type of concept that works oh so well. Last, I want to mention Perfect Days by Rafael Montes. This is the paperback cover, but the hardback is so much prettier, so I'm going to put it up here. And this is a story that follows a man who is obsessed with a young woman. He tries to date her and she turns him down, and so he decides to kidnap her and take her on the road trip across Brazil to help inspire her to write her artist work. And this is a book that is very much inspired by Misery, but at the same time its own thing. And again, if you're familiar with Misery or the tropes that this book does, you kind of know where this book is going. I basically laid out the premise of it for you. So right from the beginning, you know who the bad guy is, you know what he's gonna do, and you just watch this horrible thing unfold. And I think it is so well done. And again, so many of my favorites, if you look at my top 15 favorite thrillers video, which I'll try to remember to link down below and in the cards, it's one where a lot of the books I'm talking about are ones where you know where the story's going, and it's just so much fun to have it all laid bare. Because a big thing with these unguessable endings and these secrets is that often it means that we as the reader kind of miss out on a lot of the action and excitement of the book. Instead, these kind of books allow you to go along for all of the ride and see all the gruesome details that ensue, which as a horror reader, I really enjoy. I think that these books are fun and really kind of bridge the gap between some of my favorite genres and kind of cross them over in a way that I find really enjoyable. So I think that's it for this video here. I'd love to know your thoughts on everything I talked about today. Do you agree or disagree? You are totally allowed to have a different opinion. I think in summary, my big thing when it comes to thrillers is that I prefer books that break the mold, that try to get out of the common formula and push against what is pressured to be popular by the marketers and publishers, and try to do something different while still respecting and appreciating the genre for what it is. I think that there is this assumption that readers just need to be thrilled or surprised in some way, and really forget that a twist is only one page of a book typically, while there are, say, 300 other pages on there. And so for me, it's so much more important that I enjoy the ride, enjoy the journey, rather than depending on one page to give me that aha moment that is hopefully going to transform my reading experience. So I hope that authors will consider and think about kind of what makes a good thriller. And for me, again, it's more of that longer experience rather than shocking me with something that's totally unguessable. I think we've gotten a little bit too addicted to the concept of that perfect ending and forgetting that it's more about the ride to get there. So again, agree or disagree, love to hear your comments down below. And even if you don't have a comment, just drop an emoji like some books so I know that you're here. If you're new to my channel, I do read some thrillers as well as horror, science fiction, and fantasy. And if you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, drop that comment, or just hit that little notification bell so you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.